This podcast is part 2 of a 2-part series on the geopolitics of climate change.
One thing that interests me very much in this area, and it is in part because it forms the background for the national security challenge we face, and that is the economic and development needs of these two very, very large countries that, as you pointed out, are in quite different places. But we're in the middle of middle. It would appear there's a global economic downturn taking place. Certainly the Chinese and the Indians are both trying to anticipate that. They're seeing the consequences of it for their own economies. But at the same time, you have a country like, and the numbers just are, I can't get my mind around it. The Indians want to bring electricity to 400 million people. 400 million people.
That's right.
So the challenge that they face, they have to be concerned about the social unrest that's associated with not meeting those kinds of needs.
Yeah.
You've got the economic problem there, and the whole idea of how do you deliver energy at the same time meet the targets that both India and China have taken on in connection with Paris.
Yeah.
We've got our own problem, but it just seems to me that unless U.S., China, and India together can somehow figure out how we're going to approach this, we're not, any one of us are not going to be able to solve it.
I think that's completely key. I mean, I would sort of put it this way. I'd sort of say it's not just that India wants to bring 400 million people online and get them 24/7 access to electricity like we do in the United States. It is a development imperative that they do this, because it is an iron law of development that unless you've intentionally arranged things around you so that you can do it, if you're in a state of energy poverty, you can't get out of a state of poverty. It's just that's how closely those two are linked right now. So I completely support these aspirations in the Indian government, and when I was in office, I was doing everything I could to drive every single private sector dollar I could find, and every the much more modest public sector dollars into helping them achieve these goals. The thing that's kind of interesting, I'm not trying to be a shill for the Modi government or something like that, but I got to say, you've got to be impressed with Prime Minister Modi in the sense that whatever criticisms you want to bring to the Modi government, and there are many places which you can criticize that government, Prime Minister Modi gets it on climate change. He got it when he was Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat, where he created the first Department of Climate Change in the country. He had the most ambitious solar targets in the country. He had the most ambitious, what we would, I think, consider to be adaptation measures in the country, mostly aimed at stabilizing the water table for agriculture. And as soon as he was elected, he took the previous Congress government had a goal, this is all before Paris, right, had a goal of installing 20 gigawatts of solar power by 2022. And at the time, so this is the election, where Modi was elected in 2014, at the time they had kind of 2 gigawatts of solar. If you squinted, you could maybe push it up to 3. As soon as Modi comes in, before we talk at all about international targets, he takes that number of 20, he takes it up to 100. Says, no, our target should be 100 gigawatts by 2022. And then he adds 75 additional gigawatts of other renewables to that, mostly wind. Now, a lot of us would have said, 100, right? Like that's a big, nice round number. Yeah. That's something a leader announces. It's not as scientifically driven. Like there's not a lot of, careful understanding of what you can engineer here. But the interesting thing is, like, they're going to come pretty damn close to that. I mean, they are going to. They're actually doing really well, and it's partly because I think Modi gets it. He wants to try to do this. He kind of understands. At bottom, he definitely has to respond to the global problems that you outlined here, and the local problems. I mean, the national level problems that he's got in terms of energy access. He's got to deliver on jobs, right. But at the same time, he realizes that if India, is the third largest single country emitter in the world now, it's still relatively low compared to the U.S. and China. But if he were to put 400 million people on a fossil-driven grid, the planet is just going to become worse, and all of those development goals that he's seeking to achieve now are going to be completely undermined by this. So Modi gets it, I think, that you must decouple economic growth from growth in CO2 emissions. And I think that they are making very steady progress on their current commitments under Paris. China's making very steady progress under their current commitments on Paris, but there's not enough. And I think that when the US gets back into this, we've got to increase our targets by 2030. China and India have to do the same. I think the pathway has already been well defined, that these three countries are not going to show more ambition unless all three of them go together. And that's where the cooperative part comes into play. And I think, you know, this is so essential. It is one of the hardest parts to me about seeing the U.S. pull out of the Paris Agreement, because it sends such a terrible signal to the rest of the world. But that is where I think that we need to be, you know, very, I think, encouraged by the public support for Paris, which hopefully will mean that some future administration will rapidly get back into that game and then get back into the work of cooperating with these other major emitters.
I mean, one of the things that I think about in places like India, China, are really the problems that we face in this country as we move more toward renewable-based electric power. And that is, how do you integrate these new sources into a grid which really wasn't set to operate in those terms? And again, it goes back, these ought to be areas where we, the Chinese and Indians, kind of share ideas, technology, and indeed protections, because the vulnerabilities for cyber attack and other natural disasters are multiplied, I think, when you start getting an even more decentralized power grid. Do you have a feeling that in China in particular, that people are looking at this and trying to think through the whole process of how do you build a national economic grid that's really quite different than...
I think in China they are. I think it's and in fact I think they're thinking about this not just in terms of China's grid, but also their influence on global markets and grids. So we need to talk about Belt and Road in that context, and we'll get to it. I'm sure, but I think they get it in China. I think that the problem right now is that, you know, I think that there are lots of climate champions in the government. I think that there's also some internal changes that worry me, frankly, in terms of the dynamics, the power dynamics internally of where those climate champions sit. They used to be in the NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission. Now they've been kind of more or less moved in whole part over to the new Ministry of Environment and Ecology, MEE. And that's a ministry with kind of relatively less power than the Planning Commission. I mean, everyone has relatively less power than the Planning Commission in China. And I think so their influence and their ability to move and overrule and counterbalance some of the pressures they feel when there is an economic downturn, it is not as great. And so I think on the grid part, they get it in terms of the importance of coming up with a grid system that can be better that can better allow the onboarding of renewables. At the same time, though, we've just seen, unfortunately, an announcement that China is going to be increasing its build out of coal unexpectedly, in part, I think, again, in a response to the economic downturn. And they have not yet been able to get into a place where they're willing to basically write off that part of their industrial sector that builds coal plants. And they've already got so many coal plants that are running at less than 50%. They just don't actually need the reactors to satisfy the grid system, but they're actually going to be adding a burden there, which is creating a stranded asset. On the case in India, it's kind of interesting because there's like the bad news is sort of the good news. So the bad news is that all these people don't have access to electricity. The good news is that, in fact, you know, they don't have to restructure their grid. They can actually talk about building a grid around renewables rather than trying to integrate renewables into something else. And so that allows them to consider, for example, you know, much smaller and sort of integrated, off-grid solar solutions and other things for villages that are going to be, in the end, much cheaper than extending their national power grid to these remote areas of the country that don't have access right now. That is going to provide, I mean, you've also got to sort of also simultaneously build a platform there where you can actually get someone more than just a light bulb from off-grid solar, but actually a suite of something that looks much more like the kinds of things that energy access get you in a country like ours. And that was something that, in fact, the DOE was working really strongly on with a bunch of international partners. It was impressive, the kinds of suites of small appliances they were able to get to very, very sort of small power load. So I think that in India, I think that there's actually a greater universe of solutions. They're not backed into as much of a corner as China is at the moment.
You mentioned Belt and Road Initiative, and I know from looking at the projects in the energy sector that China is funding, they tend to be coal-fired power plants, and India's neighbor Pakistan is getting a number of those.
That's right.
Which a different topic, but the Belt and Road Initiative carries with it the potential of bringing some countries along the renewable path that maybe they wouldn't be able to do on their own. I don't know if, trying to find someone authoritative who in China who can speak about Belt and Road may be difficult. But are you seeing that kind of discussion getting?
Yeah, it's really fascinating what's happened. So, roughly speaking, and first of all, it's Belt and Road. So it's interesting because the road is actually a sea lanes and the belt are land lanes, but it's this global plan by China, which is a global development plan, opening up the rest of the world to their markets, with a big focus in Southeast Asia, then into India, Pakistan, also into Africa, but moving through Europe. I mean, part of this goes through Poland. So this is an enormous project. To put it in context, it's it looks like the projections could be 47 times larger than the Marshall Plan. This is a huge undertaking. A couple of years ago, when people started getting worried, because I think the way you put it is right. I mean, Belt and Road, if it is as big as the aspirations are, could either run us off of the climate cliff very fast without much hope of recovery, or it could be the transmission lines that actually get renewables really out there in the world. And the Chinese have great capacity in both, and so they could go either way. A couple of years ago, I think that most of my conversations in Beijing and elsewhere and with other kind of China experts was sort of kind of go, well, it's not really as centralized as you think. And I'm thinking, really, for China? So it's not really centralized as you think. These enterprises are kind of making these deals as they want to, and there's a big difference between what the state-owned enterprises are doing and what the non-state-owned enterprises are doing, what the different financial institutions are doing, and a claim of, and these other countries, they don't want renewables from us, they want fossil fuels, so we're just giving them what they want. It's not our fault that that's what they want. And that's really changed. And so if you look at the difference between, if you look at kind of just the program of the first Belt and Road Summit a few years ago, and then the second Belt and Road Summit, it's like the theme of the second Belt and Road Summit was greening Belt and Road. And they're getting it, that the world is paying attention to them, and all of the evidence so far, and there's great data that comes out of the World Resource Institute, both Boston University and Tufts University have outfits that have been doing some intensively interesting work. Kevin Gallagher at BU and Kelly Gallagher at Tufts, looking and sort of analyzing the different projects that have actually already been done under the auspices of Belt and Road, and most of the power build out is fossil fuel and fossil infrastructure. So that's a bad track record so far. The Chinese get it that the rest of the world is waking up to this and seeing this as a problem. The question now is, and now there are all these different initiatives that are in these quasi-governmental think tanks in China and other institutions that are coming up with plans on greening Belt and Road and making it more emphasis on renewables. We'll see where that goes. I think at the end of the day, frankly, the solution set on turning Belt and Road into a pro-climate initiative is going to come from shoring up the options for the countries who are recipients rather than the pressure we can put on Chinese leadership, which is pretty well insulated. So and right now, And this is again a problem when the United States is not using institutions like the Export-Import Bank of the United States and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, which we used to put billions of dollars out there. And these are not blank checks from the American people to the world. This is not, this is not overseas development assistance. These are profit-making institutions. Right. These are loans and loan guarantees, and these support U.S. jobs. We've got to get back in that business, and we've got to do it in conjunction with the Germans, right, and the Brits, and France, and the other multilateral development banks like the European Investment Bank, which has announced that just recently that they're no longer going to fund coal.
Right.
We've got to sort of come up with a package of offers that give countries an option. And we've got to be able to deliver the same kind of expertise and assistance that the Chinese are offering, whatever is on the Chinese offer, and then hopefully at some point we will be competing with the Chinese to deliver the same kind of solution set, rather than what's right now is the Chinese are offering essentially fossils and no one else is really offering anything at scale. And the thing that really, the greatest match to Chinese capacity on this is American private investment.
Right.
I mean, if you just look dollar for dollar, that's the only thing in the world that kind of matches it.
There's going to be no new Marshall.
There's not going to be another Marshall Plan 46 times larger than our original Marshall Plan, so it's got to be what we can do to mobilize private capital. Yeah.
Maybe to try to tie this up and go back to issues that I think day to day are occupying the HDIAC audience here. The whole question, it's really interesting to me as a former State Department person to talk to people in the U.S. military and outside who really, you go back to the Montreal Protocols. I'm not sure climate change is the sort of thing that gets people promoted in the military, but Navy officers in particular really understand the importance of this and the importance of talking to other countries, naval and military officers, about how are they responding to this. And this may be a little off your path, but do you have a sense, either in contacts with the Chinese Navy, Indian Navy, that these issues are occupying their thinking as well? I mean, they have bases. They have to be worried about where they're going to meet natural disasters in the neighborhood. It would strike me again as another one of those areas where cooperation would be with the U.S. would be very.
I don't really know kind of where the Chinese military and the Indian military is on this. I feel like, especially in the case of India, where they are looking at the Bangladesh border, where they're looking at the Pakistan border. I think that the kinds of disasters that they're already having to respond to, I just can't imagine that they're not including climate change in terms of their understanding of the future risks that they face. But there is no substitute to military dialogue on this, because I think you might be right. I'm not sure exactly sort of where climate change just kind of fits in terms of what's the sort of the path to advancement in the U.S. military right now, but I've never met anyone in the U.S. military who's an out-and-out skeptic about this, or someone who doesn't want to understand what the science really is telling them, not what some strange, obscure minority interpretation of the science, wishes were the truth. And so I think that, and if you sort of look at it now, I haven't had a chance to go through it, but there was just a really interesting Army War College report on the effects of climate change on the mission of the U.S. Army, which is just, again, like we've seen so many of these kind of going back now, 15 years? Of public statements by either of former military officers who are well respected, or, reports by DoD where you can kind of see that level, that climate change has been integrated into planning in a way that's much more mainstream. And so I think that it's insofar as the role that the military plays in sobering up political leaders in any of these countries about the realities that they face is important. And I think that you can never underestimate how important that is. That in that respect, the U.S. military can be one of the most important ambassadors that we have to getting the political leaders back eventually talking to each other, because by talking to their counterparts in other countries, I think that's essential. And I think a lot of this is going to be private behind the scenes, but it's there. And I think it's not just the military, I think it's also the intelligence establishment.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think that's really there. I mean, my time at State, I had a great relationship with the intelligence officers that I worked with. I saw how professional, how deep understanding that they had of these kinds of issues. They were not mucking around, again, with what are essentially kind of very minority, obscure views on the risk profile that climate change presents to us. They want to get the facts out there as much as they can. I think we saw a little bit of this in the dust-up that happened when the House Select Intelligence Committee had a special a hearing on climate change last spring. State Department and others kind of sent their intelligence officers there. There was a disagreement between where the White House was on this and where the intelligence establishment was on this. But I think at the end of the day, unfortunate as that public disagreement was, it did give you another insight that nothing's really changed, I think, here in terms of what the intelligence established there. And I've asked former people who were formerly in the intelligence agencies, do they think that other intelligence agencies around the world get this? Are they on the same page? And they say yes, definitely. We don't know what the level of planning is in other countries by and large, but I think that it's definitely there, and it's an opportunity for a conversation that, like the mill-to-mill conversation, is, again, one of these things which will hopefully get us politically aligned once again.
Well, our national security establishment, intelligence community, Defense Department, compared to other countries, just has an overwhelming amount of resources to devote to problems. And that countries that aren't in that same position recognize the problem, but they tend to take different approaches that may emphasize more, like the French Navy preparing African navies to deal with the consequences of rising sea levels in a training sense. And that may not be as grand as some of the things that we work on, but it still sends, I think, the signal that this international cooperation is critical.
No, I think that. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, I think that's right, and just the way just that one point. I mean, we have been there. This wouldn't be to invent this out of whole cloth. I mean, just a few years ago, the G7 foreign ministers commissioned a study on climate and security that was carried out by a few think tanks, one in Germany, a couple others. And really, the sort of the plan that was unfolding there towards the end of the Obama administration was something like this, where the major powers could work around the world where they had some historical relationship with some of these climate vulnerable countries, and to help, share the best that they had to offer. And I think that's what we got to get back to, because we need to be really clear here that even if we hit the targets under Paris, the temperature targets under Paris, we are entering a world where there's going to be displacement that we have only encountered in the past in the cases of global conflict. Right. So it's not like we haven't been there before, but we haven't been there under these conditions, and we haven't been there in a case where we can imagine here's when the conflict would end, and then here's the post-conflict period of recovery. This is going to be something that's going to go on for a long time, and of course gets worse if we don't hit the targets that we're trying to do. And this will require a level of global cooperation to deal with this displacement effectively the military and our foreign policy establishment and our intelligence agencies are the front lines for that. And that is part of the mission going forward.
Andrew, thank you very much for this. I think that the key takeaway in this regard, and I think for the viewers in the HD IAC family, the technology and the equipment that's being developed today to prepare our military to deal with the future is going to be affected by things like climate change, and the fact that there will be more requirements on the U.S. military to deploy in support of relief, rehabilitation, and ultimately restoring resiliency in some of these communities is going to be greater, and it's going to affect the kinds of equipment that the U.S. military is going to be deploying in these situations. So resilience, sustainability, the broader question of climate change, all of these things come together, and I think this has really been a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks.